Hi everyone, it's Friday. It must therefore be coffee and chat time, and Gordon has got coffee. Well done, Gordon. I always fail at this point and suddenly realise I've got an empty glass, but for once I do have a full glass, although it's not coffee. Today's subject, business skills, pricing without fear. It's one of those areas that is really difficult to handle at the moment, particularly with what's going on in the economy. We have three guest speakers, I hope, with us today, or people that we want to chat with. I am exceptionally pleased to introduce you to Andrew, who is working a lot with SMEs and supporting them in how to price without fear. Gordon works with a much larger organisation who has far fewer problems, I would imagine, in pricing at this particular moment. But that doesn't mean that it's not, equally difficult and challenging at times, I'm sure. So today's conversation is very much eclectic, as always. I'm sure we'll go all over the place. Please, if you have any questions, and there are quite a few of you listening in, then just pop them in the chat room. We might well be joined by a fourth person, but please pop them in the chat room at any stage. Now, I'm going to ask Becky to just take us on so that we can see the various people that we have in the chat room and their backgrounds. So as you can see, we might well be joined by Gary in a moment few, but he is having a few problems with Citrix. And you can see a little bit about the individuals that are with us today. So from my perspective, and I'm going to start the conversation off, as somebody that delivers commercial and contract management training all the time and sourcing training all the time, and as somebody that bids into the public sector, pricing is always one of those areas that we spend quite a lot of time on. Theoretically, obviously, we'll have done the whole piece about thinking about Deming. We will have thought about whether we're going to put ourselves into a sector, how many other people are pricing in this space. And one of my colleagues, who unfortunately has now left our business, but we're still very good friends with, was talking this week about long-term relationships and therefore the ability to actually have a long-term relationship with somebody, and that makes a difference with pricing. Unfortunately, for an SME like us, it's often not the concept of long-term. It tends to be far more transactional. So our Andrew, how do you feel this whole situation at the moment? With regards to, we're in the middle of a pandemic. The market is obviously struggling in quite a few areas. Where's your big advice at the moment?
My big advice is, I think we've got to be, show a lot of empathy for businesses. They will, in some cases, businesses will be finding it a little bit tough. Some will be finding it extremely tough. And there are also businesses that are actually doing pretty good. So I think we've got to be quite empathetic about businesses' situation, but also not rush into anything. Price is so important to companies in a range of ways that, people should just sit back and think about their market, their customers, where they want to go, their own situation, and not make quick, rash reactions to what's going on. Really think about it before you do anything.
So your advice to people is market first?
I would also always get people to think about their own value. What's the value that they deliver for their customers? What results do they get them? What's the value of the product? Because that anchors what pricing is all about. So they still need to be focused on that. Then they need to think about what other people are doing in the market and what's happening with the market and demand, and then go from there. So keep focused on what you're great at doing as your foundation to what your pricing approach is.
Is that where you're coming from as well, Gordon? Obviously a very different business and where you are at the moment.
Yes, so firstly, can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so our business, we supply patent protected medicines to the NHS. So it's quite different in that we've got one monopsony purchaser, so lots of suppliers, one customer. So I think right now it's a difficult and challenging position where the NHS wants to manage its costs and its supply chain in the short term, and they're asking us for what we can do to help, and as companies and as an industry we're responding to that. But I think the challenge is going to be making sure that we don't give price away in the short term at the moment by being supportive of the NHS and what they're trying to achieve, and then find ourselves unable to go back to the pricing levels we had before. So I think that's challenge number one. And I think challenge number two for us is the value, and it goes to what Andrew said, any product starts with understanding your value, but the value to the NHS has changed in a lot of areas. So for example, we've got treatments that are probably more expensive than others, but keep people out of hospital. Now, those have not been valued by the NHS, but now the value of it has changed. So that environment's changed, and we've now gone back and said, look, here are areas we'd like you to consider differently because they'll achieve the aim of protecting people in a safer environment. So the value's changed. And that's something we've responded to, but also be careful about price. I think particularly if you've got a very strong purchaser, they will use that strength right now to get better prices, and you may not be able to recover that ground in 6 or 12 months' time.
Yeah, we find it really difficult on occasion to encourage our clients to look at the whole cost, not just the price. So, whether it's be a disposal cost or the fact that they're saving money in certain areas, there are often, commercial officers and contract managers in particular, as sourcing professionals, will often think about simply price and the technical solution rather than the full cost of any solution. And, keeping somebody out of hospital obviously reduces cost in a different area of the NHS budget. So I guess that's really where you're coming from, Gordon. And for me, you've got to do quite a lot of work in that whole BD space and, that persuasion and negotiation space in order for them to understand that. And in a highly competitive market, and many of us are working in a highly competitive market at the moment, it's quite a difficult conversation to be having. Andrew, with the SMEs, are you finding that they're not really thinking through the value that is more than just price, or are they able to do that at the moment?
I think many are able to do that. I think perhaps the difference is they tend to be a little bit more reactive. I think, as Gordon says, got a number of challenges that you can think through and think about the short and the medium long-term perspective of how you price to those customers. I think SMEs tend to be a bit more reactive, short-term, so they're taking actions on price without necessarily safeguarding their position in the future. So, quite often speak to them about, well, if your customers in your market means that you might have to adjust pricing in the short term, make sure you do it on the right terms. So, as Gordon alluded to, in 6 months' time, when things begin, well, hopefully move back to normal, you've got a very strong rationale and a reason to talk to your customers about getting back on to the footing of where you are. So, again, thinking about it, but they tend to be more reactive, which is a bit of a worry, really.
Yeah, my favourite theorist in this space, Deming, he talks about the fact that supply chain needs to be very aware, or the purchaser needs to be very, very aware that if they only procure against price, then people will start to exit the market because they can't afford to deliver at that price. And as soon as you have a large number of people exiting the market, then guess what? The price goes up because you get into a monopoly position. So the long-term scenario means that you're actually paying more over a period of time. For many in the public sector, it's quite difficult to take a long-term view for lots of different reasons, including annualization, etc. But this whole, in order to really get some understanding, you have to, if you're the purchaser, give some concept to that long-term position. I find that quite difficult as somebody who delivers training to have that we are a transactional purchase often. It's quite difficult to have that conversation with some of the people that purchase from us, to explain that actually it's a quality product. We're trying to be a Waitrose, not a low-end economy. So, there is a certain value to the product that we're putting out. There is certain benefit in gaining the qualifications that we're delivering. But that sell is quite a difficult one. And from, my market, what often happens in a recession, and please, let's hope that, the present market conditions don't mean that we go into a full-blown recession, although obviously they've actually declared it because of the economic situation over the last couple of months. A lot of people come into training because it's assumed that, we've all been to school, therefore we're all experts, and therefore we can all be in training. Therefore, lots of people flood into the market, and of course what that does is it depresses the price as an automatic because there are far more people supplying. and that also becomes a challenge. So, you know, we chose the topic, you know, quite specifically the topic title, which was very much about what's the issue with regards to the fear of pricing, because you are making this gamble. I don't know how you guys feel. I mean, with regards to, you know, what I've said about Deming and this concept of the lower the price from a purchaser's perspective, the more people will exit the market. Gordon, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, in pharmaceuticals and medicines, it's longer term, but I think that longer term thing just presents a bigger challenge for your purchaser, because by the time they realize they're in difficulty, and I'll give you the example of antibiotics, which everybody will be familiar with. We keep saying that the world's running out of antibiotics. The world's probably running out of research into antibiotics, because when global companies sit down and look at where they're going to invest their money, they look at antibiotics and they realize there's very little money to be made in antibiotics, because when you produce a new one that's effective, it won't get used. So you're going to put your money into other areas. You'll put it into cancer, into Alzheimer's. You'll put it into research areas where you know you can help benefit patients directly. So you've got a situation where there's almost a market failure in certain areas, because the purchasing price for antibiotics has been driven down so relentlessly that treatments that will save someone's life are available for £5 or £6 a shot. Now, that's great for patients that need these medicines today, but if you need new medicines in the antibiotics arena, you're not going to get them if you think the price should be £5 or £6 a treatment instead of potentially £1,000 or £2,000 a treatment.
So it's almost recognizing that research and development cost that is incumbent in some of the work that you're doing.
Oh, definitely. And I think right now, if you look across the water to the US is the biggest purchaser and the highest price payer in the world for pharmaceuticals. And Donald Trump feels he is paying for the R&D of other countries. And if you look at the UK has a fairly unique position in it. Across Europe, it pays the least for its new treatments, its new medicines. So there's a transfer of that value coming from the US to the UK, because we pay well below the kind of prices that should be paid to allow future research and development on a global scale. And that has implications for global companies investing into the UK. But as you've outlined earlier on, if you're a purchaser in the NHS, you are prioritizing price and a low price over anything else. You're not paid, and quite rightly, you're not paid to incentivize companies to research in the UK or research in particular areas.
Yeah. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I think from the markets and the companies that I deal with, there is that tendency to lots of people to come into markets when the price goes down. I think it comes back to positioning and how companies differentiate themselves to their competitors, and being quite bullish about it. So, you know, if you've got a strong value proposition and you can be different to your competitors, then you know, to maintain their prices where they want them to be, companies have just got to be a lot more bullish and a lot more forceful about getting those messages across to people. And I never agree that, you know, we should make direct comparisons in a negative sense with competitors, but we can, you know, we can be a little bit more forceful about, you know, why people should be engaging with us and why they should be prepared to pay more to get that value, and the downside of that not happening for them.
Yeah, I often feel, Andrew, that that's very true in the public sector. I'm never in the private sector. I'm never sure that it's that true in the public sector, particularly as procurement officers tend to go technical price. And if it's more than 60-40, price is always the most important thing. So it becomes something in the public sector where price is the driving factor. And many of us, you know, work in the public sector, and this race to the lowest cost, or the race to the lowest price, always really worries me. I you know, because all they'll get downstream is nobody wanting to play in the space, and a monopoly situation growing very rapidly, or as Gordon's just saying, no ability to do any research work because there's no money in it, and therefore you can't do it. And downstream, you know, costs will be sky high because they won't be able to afford hospitals, they won't be able to afford to, you know, we will almost have written off certain deaths because we can't afford to treat them. And that worries me, if I'm honest. You know, I don't really know how to persuade the public sector that that actually isn't the way forward. I mean, I've just got a brilliant, Gary, I know that you were online talking, so but talking only, we haven't got your photograph. But have you got anything that you want to add on this debate about, you know, how to stop this crash to the bottom on price, particularly for the public sector? Maybe I'm wrong. I was told you were online, but I can't hear you, so I'm going to make you the assumption that you're not. I've got an absolutely brilliant.
Hello, Kath.
There you are.
Hello,
hi, Gary.
hi. Yes, sorry, had some real technical difficulties getting through, but great to see everyone, and thank you for having me along. Yeah, in terms of the race to the bottom you were mentioning.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, I'm thinking about Deming and what he said about, you know, the lower the price, the more people will have to exit the market because they won't be able to do business at that rate. As soon as you've got people exiting from the market, you go into a monopoly situation, and then in the long term, the price goes up.
Yes, exactly. And I think I just picked up on the last bit that Andrew was mentioning about value, really. It's very much around the value proposition and demonstrating why the price is the price that's set. I'm a firm believer in people buy on value, not on price, which in a tricky market, as you mentioned, Kath, when it's a race to the bottom, is a tricky proposition to communicate, but nevertheless needs to be tackled. It needs to be discussed and demonstrated as to why a price of a proposal, a package, a product or a service is the price it is. I think it is around value, and value does not just include price. It includes longevity, specification, consistency, reliability, all those types of variables underpin why the price is as it is. But sometimes suppliers fail to communicate that and just instantly cut the price, whereas they could be reinforcing the value of why the price is what it is.
It's interesting you make that comment, because when I first worked in the commercial sector, which is only 15 years ago, having spent a long time in the public sector in the Ministry of Defence, I came across a company who had a absolutely brilliant product, absolutely brilliant, but it was so brilliant that it never fell apart. And they don't exist any longer because they sold at a good price, but they don't exist because it never fell apart, and therefore nobody ever needed to rebuy it. And it became impossible to actually have a business model unless they'd actually, you know, managed to persuade more customers to buy them, which they never did. They were just too good. They were over-engineered, if you like. And I think that's really, really fascinating when you get that value proposition in. It's almost being too good. Gordon, you've just smiled. I don't know if you recognise that as a problem area, but.
Yeah, I mean, I took over a business unit years ago, and I was told it was injectable syringes for emergency use, and I was told, it's great, don't worry about it, you're going to do really well, because ours is there's only two suppliers. We're the only supplier that allows this treatment to connect to every connector inside a hospital. So I thought, tremendous, you know, we've got the market there. When I then tried to understand the customer's perspective, we held an advisory board with some senior anaesthetists and senior accident and emergency consultants and said, do you like our product? And I said, no, not really. I said, but don't you like the fact that it connects to every single adapter in the hospital that you use? And he said, well, no, not at all. And so if you're in an emergency situation, how do you treat the patient? You know, because you can't use the other guy's product. I would just pull the connectors off and then use his product. I said, so you're not worried about infection? I said, the patient's already dead. We use your product to try and bring them back to life. So our priority is time. How quickly can we get this patient treated with a new drug, with the drug they need, not whether or not your drug will connect with our connectors and prevent infection. If the patient doesn't come back to life, there's not an infection risk. And if they do come back to life, we've saved their life, and the infection risk is a lower consideration. So I had completely misunderstood what mattered to the customer. Now, I'll briefly take a second and explain you the other side of the story, which was when we said, okay, what don't you like about a product then? What do you really hate? And they said, shelf life. You've got a 1-year shelf life. Okay, why does that matter? Well, every 9 months, we go around the hospital, we pick up 500 boxes with all your drugs in it, we open them up, we take them out, we put new stuff in. Why is that a problem? It needs a trained pharmacist. So what I found out was, In an average account, we'd sell them £5,000 worth of kit a year, but we're probably spending £10,000 in pharmacist time. So I said quite simply to them, if I could double the shelf life, how much more would you be willing to pay? So we ended up charging them 3 times as much as we charged them before. We doubled the shelf life, and we earned 5 times as much in profits the next year, because we understood what mattered, what didn't matter, which was connectivity, and what did matter. The whole cost of the pathway. When we looked at the pathway, no one had looked at the whole pathway cost, because they only considered the effectiveness of the drug, not the cost to the whole account of managing the drug supply chain.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Anything in the same sort of area, Andrew, in your experience?
I think lots of experiences of people just not having that great conversation that Gordon's talked about. Specifically, the words that you use are really great. You know, what's really important to your customer? What matters to them? You know, what matters most to them? And going through a process of trying to work that out, you know, can uncover all sorts of areas of additional value, cost reduction, and can take you in a completely different place. But lots of businesses I work with still start from, this is us, this is our product, this is what we do. Yeah, so what? Yeah. Who's interested in it? What we want to know is what you do for us and how you can sort out our problem or our issue, or get us a product that does this for us. But people generally don't want to engage in that, perhaps because they don't really want to know the answer.
So it's listening to the voice of the customer, isn't it? I mean, I've got a great question in from Mark, who asks, how can companies seek the voice of the customer, and what potential market indicators could be tracked? For example, GDP or CPI or employability. You know, Gordon's just given us a perfect example of going and seeking the voice of the customer by asking them a simple question. You know, what are you doing with my product, and why don't you like it? You know, those are 2 really straightforward questions. Sometimes it's quite difficult to get that voice of the customer. Gary, I don't know if you can still hear me, but what would you recommend with regards to this concept of getting the voice of the customer and potential market indicators to help people price?
In terms of getting the voice of the customer, it is really down to the simple but often neglected skill of questioning and listening, essentially. Getting under the skin of the customer, you know, what's the itch that they need scratching, and how can your product or service help them alleviate that scratch or itch in an effective way? And it's around communicating not just the features. Gordon and Andrew have both alluded to the fact that a lot of salespeople still talk features, and companies buy benefits, not features. So it's around communicating that what does that feature do for that customer at that specific moment in time? What's the advantage and the benefit to that specific customer? And if there are any market metrics that or research that backs that case up, then so much the better. But it really is, in my view, a fundamental of going back to basics and asking great questions, keeping an open mind. Just because you've asked a great question and they come out with some great information, keep quiet, don't interrupt, let them speak, let them finish, because there's so much gold dust there that you can then use in your sales presentation, your price presentation later on. So I hate to be kind of go back to basics, Kath, but I think it is that. I think it's being consistently good at delivering the basics.
Mm-hmm. Can I give a quick comment on that, Kath? One of the things we do in my industry is, because of the nature of pharmaceuticals, and when you launch a new drug, you need to understand what the risks and side effects are. So we set up quite an extensive customer complaint line, for want of a better description. So every time there's a side effect that a GP or a hospital consultant sees, they fill out a form and they send it to us. So we get huge amounts, probably more than any other industry. We get customer complaints all the time. And in businesses I've run, I've always sat down every month and looked at the customer complaints. Now, often it will be unexpected side effects which aren't particularly relevant to how you run the business, but sometimes they'll tell you stuff about your products you just don't know. And we had one situation where one customer said, I really don't like your product because it's in a cardboard box. Okay, cardboard box packaging. So we looked into this and went to the hospital that used our competitors and realized theirs was in a plastic box. Now, we couldn't change the box for a lot of reasons. It was a global product, but what we did was we sat down and we designed a kind of plastic briefcase with foam inserts, and we packed every one of these into a foam insert. And when we went along with this big box, a nice polystyrene flexible box, which was a light year ahead of the box they threw everything else into, they said, this is fantastic. This is just what we need. Every single one of these hospital wards should have one of these boxes. You pull it off the shelf, everything's packed in foam inside of it. So we took a weakness of our product that we couldn't change, thought about the wider value to the customer, turned it into a strength, and turned over a whole load of hospitals from our competitors because of that. So customer complaint lines are amazing things.
Really nice idea. Really nice idea. Andrew, any similar hints and tips?
No, I'd agree. I think it's talking to your customers, finding out more, asking those sorts of questions, and just being open-minded to, to an extent, to the fact that you might find things out that are quite uncomfortable, that you really need to address and do differently, and it might take you in a different direction.
Particularly if you're an SME, because you, of course, love your product and you think everybody's going to buy it because they all love it too.
Yeah, and it's all you've ever done, and all of a sudden somebody's telling you it's sort of not quite what it should be, and that's a tough one. But it's a great way of finding out.
Yeah, so listen a lot. I mean, I guess my last question, and we are really, really short on time. Mark made the comment, and I think this is true, when it's in tender or bid work, the value proposition only really works when you've communicated it prior to bid. Because at bid work, they've already decided on what the split is between the technical solution and the price solution. And unless they've included something like value add or social value, or it's very difficult to get the value proposition in there. You can reflect, but the division is already made. They've already made that decision on the split. So it is a really difficult area. As normal, guys, we've run out of time. We always do. We promised at the very beginning of these series that we'd only be talking for 30 minutes, mainly because so many of them were over an hour long, and that just seemed way too long for people. So I'm really grateful for your time. Some great ideas there. Gary, I'm sorry we couldn't see you, but thank you for your interjections. Really, really useful. And Gordon, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Next week we're moving completely in a different direction. I got it completely wrong last week, but next week we're moving in a completely different direction and looking at the 5 dysfunctions of a team, which is a big area for us, particularly as most of you are aware, have just moved into the apprenticeship area, and team leading is one of our endpoint assessment standards. So very much an area that we've been looking at in a lot of depth, leadership and team leading. So looking forward to being part of that discussion. We have a couple of people joining us next week with a completely new way of looking at the value chain, with Martin, who's going to explain to us a different approach to looking at the value chain, which actually would have worked just as well in this conversation with regards to figuring out what the value chain is and what the customer is prepared to spend. But thank you so much for your time, everyone. I hope to speak to you soon. And as they say, it's Friday. It's now 1:30 or just about to be. And hope to see you soon. Take care now. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.